Helen of Troy, by repute, the most beautiful woman who ever existed, the most beautiful woman in the Greek world, the face that launched 1,000 ships, the person whose abduction kick-started the Trojan War. So the woman who is at the center of arguably the most influential epic narrative ever written.
So this is coming off the back of an episode on Custer, and we've been looking at in the industrial society of America and all that kind of thing, and obviously talking about women laying eggs and being attacked by swans and things. I mean, it might seem very different, but of course we were talking about the power of myth in the context of the Lakota, weren't we? And these myths,
or indeed of Custer. Custer is a mythological figure.
Yeah, but Custer would have no place for kind of talking animals or things like that.
No, he'd stuff an animal, but he wouldn't talk to it.
He'd stuff it, but not talk. Exactly so. But in Greece, these stories have a kind of power and resonance of the kind that you would witness in Lakota society in the late 19th century. And it kind of, just mention it because it gives a sense of how these stories are not just imaginative fantasies for children, which is often how Greek myths are presented. They are terrifying stories. I mean, terrible things happen in them, but they channel aspects of Greek culture that are incredibly significant.
Yeah.
And as you say, the idea of Helen as the face that launches 1,000 ships, I mean, that's a line from a play by Christopher Marlowe, contemporary of Shakespeare. So that's almost 3,000 years after Helen of Troy is supposed to have lived, and there's still this kind of power. And there's this philosophers have come up with this measure of beauty, which is a millihelen, and it's the amount of beauty that is sufficient to launch a ship. So Helen has 1,000 millihelens, and so the potency of the most beautiful woman in the world as a myth, I think, is very enduring. But there's also the possibility that the stories that the Greeks in the classical period, so that's kind of 6th, 5th, 4th centuries BC, that they might be looking back to a much earlier period, the period of perhaps a historical Trojan War.
Well, people have always been fascinated by this, haven't they? The idea that maybe a queen was kidnapped, maybe there was some dynastic marriage gone wrong, maybe that provokes a war between cities on different sides of the Aegean.
Yes. So this also is part, I think, of the fascination of the stories of Helen of Troy. So I thought, to begin with, let's look at the life of Helen as told by the Greeks.
Brilliant.
And this is basically, I've kind of stitched it together from various sources.
So people are writing about it before Homer. He's not the first.
Homer is the first, but Homer leaves lots of space. So he doesn't cover every aspect of her.
So people fill it in afterwards.
Yeah, and when Homer introduces Helen, he doesn't explain who she is. He is taken for granted that people already know who she is.
So she's already interesting. She's already a folk figure, if you like.
Yeah, and so the birth of Helen is something that is conceived by Zeus, and there is an epic that follows shortly after Homer called the Kypria. We only have fragments of it, and it explains how Zeus wants to destroy, or rather winnow, humanity. He wants to diminish it. And so there was a time when the countless tribes of men, though wide dispersed, oppressed the surface of the deep-bosomed earth, and Zeus saw it and had pity, and in his wise heart resolved to relieve the all-nurturing earth of men, that the load of death might empty the world. And this is something that you get a lot in Near Eastern myths. So, in the Bible, God sends a flood. Yeah. You get the same in kind of Babylonian myth and so on. What's distinctive about this is that Zeus is advised by a character called Momos, or Blame, that this is really boring. He should go for something much more fun, and that he should ensure the birth of two completely luminous and fatal figures. And one of them is the son of a nymph called Thetis. And Thetis, the prophecy is that Thetis, that her son will be greater than the father. And Zeus had been planning to marry her, but gets warned off by this, and so marries her to a kind of rather dull hero called Peleus. And their son is called Achilles.
Of heel fame.
And Achilles will be the greatest warrior on the field of Troy in the Trojan War. But he also decides that he will father a daughter. And there is something. So we I think the last time we quoted Yeats was his great poem on the Easter Rising, and there's this phrase, "A terrible beauty is born." And Helen is a terrible beauty. I mean, there's a sense of dread as well as of pleasure about this.
Because of the number
Helen's
of people who will lose their lives because of Helen, right? I mean, she's fatal.
Absolutely. Helen is fateful. So where does Helen come from? So there are various stories. Greek myth is not like the Bible. There isn't a kind of single canonical account. So there is one story that Aphrodite, the goddess of love, who emerges from the foam of the sea, so as in the famous Botticelli painting, that the foam hardens and becomes a swan's egg, and it's thrown into a swamp where it fertilizes, and Helen hatches from it. So that's one story.
That's just bizarre.
I'm mad.
Sorry, Tom. Yeah, that is mad.
That never happened.
I think the thing about the swan is much more plausible.
Well, so another story is that Zeus, he changes into a swan, but the person he rapes isn't Leda. It's Nemesis, so kind of retribution. And he either chases her across the world, and they're constantly changing form, a bit like in the cartoon of The Sword and the Stone. People who've seen that. And another is that he pretends to be chased by an eagle, and Nemesis takes the swan into her fold to shelter the swan, and then the swan behaves disgracefully.
And the eagle is Aphrodite in disguise.
Yes.
That's a complicated story.
Very complicated, but which is why I think the basically the version that becomes most popular and is told most often is the story that it is Leda who gets raped, and Leda is the queen of Sparta, and her husband, the king of Sparta, is a man called Tyndareus, and in a way that is never entirely explained, Leda that night sleeps both with Tyndareus and with Zeus in the form of a swan. So she has quite an active night.
Very busy night.
And this is why when she gives birth to quadruplets, you have the two mortal and two immortal children hatching out of the eggs that she lays. And the Spartans are actually very proud of this story. And so there's Pausanias, who's a Greek writing in the 2nd century AD. He's basically kind of writing a travel guide to Greece. And he says that in Sparta, you can see the shell of the egg, and it's preserved in a temple on the Acropolis in Sparta.
So his advice to travellers to Sparta, Tom, was 1,000 times better than your advice to me when I went to Sparta, and you recommended that I go to a place that when I Googled it said notorious hangout for down and out thieves, drug addicts, and so on.
Well, we'll be coming to that advice because, of course, so Helen grows up, and Spartan girls are notorious in the Greek world for being educated. So they're the only girls who get a state education in Greece.
Right.
And there's a big focus on kind of sport and athletics. And Euripides, who is an Athenian who writes famous tragedies in the 5th century BC, he has a description of Helen doing gym work with the other girls in Sparta, her thighs naked, exposed by the lifting of her skimpy tunic, sharing with boys the running track and the gymnasium. You know, I've said that Greek myths are often seen as being suitable for children. They are absolutely not. They are shocking. And there are repeated instances, for instance, of rape. And this is what happens with Helen. She is out with the girls, practicing her sport, probably, Dominic, tradition says, at the site of the temple of Artemis Orthia, which
that's
is
the
the
place.
temple that I sent you to.
Right. Well, I didn't go. We went to a restaurant instead.
Well,
anyway, go on.
So, and it's an ill-omened place because this is where Helen. She's 12 years old. So 12 is traditionally the age at which girls become available to be married. So she is on the cusp of being nubile. And she is spotted by a Greek hero who's very famous, who probably most people who've read any book on the Greek myths will have heard of. And this is Theseus, the Athenian hero who kills the Minotaur on Crete. And in the books about Theseus that I read when I was a child, this episode was not mentioned.
No,
but Theseus
he's
is passing the temple of Artemis Orthia, and he sees the 12-year-old Helen, and he is transfixed that she is the most beautiful thing he has ever seen. And so he abducts her. He takes her back to Attica, the land around Athens. He imprisons her on the Acropolis of a town there called Aphidna, and he appoints his mother, Aithra, to look after the young Helen. And then he goes off to try and abduct and rape Persephone, who is the queen of the dead, the wife of Hades, as you do. And while he is down in the underworld, he ends up getting stuck to a seat and has to be rescued in the long run by Hercules. Castor and Pollux come and rescue their sister, and they sack Aphidna, and they take Aithra to serve Helen as her maid, which is
what
a
question about this, that you said this was Euripides. How much is that story? Obviously, Theseus is associated with Athens. She's from Sparta. How much does that story reflect the political culture of the wars, the rivalry between Athens and Sparta? So it's a story of Athenians sacking Sparta or something, isn't it? That's what is ultimately behind this fantasy.
The way that Euripides frames it, in the depths of the Peloponnesian War, this terrible conflict between Athens and Sparta, is definitely drawing on that. But the roots of the story are much older. And this is the fascination of it, is that elements of the story can just be reworked by Greeks at various points and with various perspectives. But the core of the story does genuinely seem to be very ancient. And running throughout it is this idea that Helen's beauty drives men mad. And so people may wonder, well, what did she look like? So Bethany Hughes has written a wonderful book on Helen of Troy, both as myth and the possible history that might lie behind her. I mean, she observes that the wonderful irony about the most beautiful woman in the world is that she is faceless. But there are kind of various traditional attributes of her beauty that are described repeatedly. So one is that she has white skin like the shell that she hatched from.
Yeah. So
she is always described as kind of blindingly white. She is golden haired. Her hair is described as xanthous. So that is a color that is associated with the divine. Her hair is more beautiful than any other woman's. And she has perfect breasts, milky white breasts. And the evidence for this is adduced by Pliny the Elder, the great Roman encyclopedist, who records that in Rhodes, in a temple of Athena, there is a goblet, and it is said to have been cast to correspond to the dimensions of one of Helen's breasts. And people go and admire it and say, yes, that is absolutely
So just
perfect.
at this stage, I know you'll probably come to this in the second half, so we don't need to get into the whole weeds of the discussion right away. But obviously, so far, everything that has been written, and indeed, presumably the goblet and so on and so forth, has been made by men. And lots of people listening to this will be thinking this is just a kind of male fantasy. This is the male gaze, run riot, Tom. This is just a total male sexist fantasy. So we should come to the discussion of that probably later on, I guess.
We will. And there is one very famous Greek writer, female Greek writer, who does write about Helen.
Yeah.
We'll come to her in due course. But you're right. I mean, she is driving men mad. And the fact that she's been abducted and raped as a girl does not put off her suitors. Quite the opposite. So Tyndareus basically says, I don't know what to do about this. Every man in Greece, every powerful king in Greece wants her. What am I going to do? Mm-hmm. And Odysseus, the most cunning and clever of the Greek heroes, comes up with this wheeze, and he says, "Well, get all the heroes to swear an oath that if any one of them abducts her, everyone else will team together and get Helen back." And Tyndareus thinks, "Yeah, that's a brilliant idea. I'll do that." And Odysseus' reward for this is that he gets as his wife Helen's cousin Penelope, who in the epics will serve as a model of the faithful wife. She's sensible, she's wise, and in a way kind of a much better wife than Helen. But obviously everyone wants Helen, and the person who ends up getting her is a guy called Menelaus.
Yeah,
who actually
useless, totally useless in all the stories.
I mean, he's certainly he's not on a level with Helen. So for starters, he's a younger brother, and that's kind of Dominic. You and I are both elder brothers, so
yeah, younger brothers.
We approve of the Greek tradition that says the elder brother is generally more admirable. Some even say that Menelaus' elder brother, who is Agamemnon, the man who will marry Helen's sister Clytemnestra, that he does the wooing for Menelaus. And Menelaus at this point does not have a palace for reasons that we'll come to later. So he moves into Tyndareus' palace and in due course inherits it and Helen's treasure and gold. So he is pretty much completely defined by Helen. And this is emasculating for a Greek king. He is behaving like the bride, moving into the person he's marrying home. So basically his rank depends on being married to Helen. And this is a cause of embarrassment. And they have a daughter, but they have no son. And I think there's generally a sense that Helen is too beautiful to have children. She stays kind of preternaturally beautiful throughout, and the experience of motherhood is not something that ages her, which presumably is why she doesn't have lots of children. Anyway, so they're all hanging out. Menelaus and Helen and their daughter Hermione are in Sparta when who should turn up but a prince from Troy,
Paris,
a city on the other side of the Aegean, called Paris. And Paris has come to Sparta, sent by Aphrodite, the goddess of love, because we talked about how the Greeks loved a beauty contest, and even the goddesses occasionally like a beauty contest. And a golden apple has been thrown into a banquet with the phrase "to the fairest," and three goddesses. Hera, the queen of the gods, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty and love. So you think, actually, I mean, she was always going to win a beauty contest. But anyway, Paris has been appointed to judge between them. He has chosen Aphrodite. And so Aphrodite, in return, has promised him the most beautiful woman in the world. And this is why Paris has arrived. And Paris is much better suited to Helen than Menelaus is, because if Sparta is famous among the Greeks as the home of the most beautiful women, Troy is famous for the beauty of its men. So Ganymede, the cupbearer of Zeus, is a Trojan.
Yeah.
And so Paris he has a slightly kind of feminine quality to his handsomeness.
And he behaves he's a kind of feline figure, isn't he? Paris?
Yes, he's feline. Yes, absolutely. And he is stalking Helen. And Menelaus makes it very easy for him because his grandfather has died in Crete. And so he goes away, and Helen and Menelaus are left alone in Sparta. And Paris sets off with her. Now, the question is, does Helen go willingly or not? So is this another story of rape? And a lot of contemporary renderings of the story say that it is. But it has to be said that basically the ancients are pretty unanimous. Helen chooses to go. And more than that, she actually dazzles Paris. She takes her treasure with her. When she goes, in all the epics, the tragedies, all the accounts, she is never described as Paris's concubine or whore or slave. She's always his wife. So she maintains her status and her rank and her dignity, but at the cost of being, an adulteress. So she is going. And you asked about, has a woman written about Troy? Sappho, who is a famous lyric poet. We've only have fragments of her poetry, but she was celebrated as the 10th muse. She wrote, "For she that far surpassed all mortals in beauty, Helen, her most noble husband deserted and went sailing to Troy with never a thought for her daughter and dear parents." So that is, Sappho is seizing on the things that a woman is seen in Greek culture that she should properly be doing, looking after her parents, looking after her children, looking after her husband. Helen, not doing any of that. She has a kind of what in Greek terms is a sense of masculine autonomy. And she goes off with Paris, and they have their first night together on a rocky island called Cranae, which is just off the mainland of Sparta. And in the Iliad, Homer's great epic, so kind of almost 9 years later, Paris still remembers that night as something remarkable and extraordinary. And he takes her off to Troy, and all the Trojans are besotted with her as well. So that when Menelaus and Odysseus come to ask for Helen back, all the Trojans say, no, we're not going to give her back, even though they know that the Greeks have sworn this oath that they will get together and come and get her. The Trojans won't do it. They're
so dazzled,
kind of
Paris
so
was by
overwhelmed.
Her beauty. Yeah,
absolutely. And so there's a philosopher called Socrates, an Athenian in the 4th century, who says that this is why the Trojan War is the greatest and most terrible conflict ever fought. So he says, it is clear how both sides felt about her, the Trojans as well as the Greeks. For although there had been many causes of contention between them before, none of these had disturbed their peace, whereas over Helen they fought the greatest of wars, greatest not only for the scale of the passion involved, but also for how long it lasted and the sheer scale of the violence it unleashed. And this violence is made worse by the fact that the gods too end up fighting over Helen. So in the Trojan War, Aphrodite is on one side, the side of Paris and the Trojans, and Athena and Hera are on the Greek side because they hate Paris.
Yeah.
But basically they're fighting over Helen. And Isocrates says the whole universe goes mad. And he draws this conclusion that beauty by nature rules over strength. So you were saying, this is a male fantasy, but essentially what Socrates is doing there is saying the power of Helen's beauty is greater than the strength of all the men who came to fight her.
So if you go to Homer's epic, the Iliad, obviously most of the action, or indeed almost all of the action, revolves around the men. You're right, Achilles, Hector, Patroclus, Odysseus, and so on and so forth. What does Helen have? She does have a role in the Trojan War story, doesn't she? Because when Paris is killed, how was Paris killed again? Is he killed by an arrow? Have I got that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And then she marries somebody else, Deiphobus. He's a lucky man because he gets to, he gets the most beautiful woman.
Well, he's not a lucky man, actually. I mean, so he is the 4th of Helen's husbands. Yeah. He's a brother of Paris.
Fourth.
Very good warrior.
Oh, because Theseus, I forgot about Theseus.
Yeah, so there's Theseus as well.
Yeah.
So actually, he's not lucky because Helen completely stiffs him over. And Helen is behaving very badly towards the end of the Trojan War. So the famous story of the Trojan Horse, all the Greeks have hidden themselves inside the horse and the horse gets wheeled into Troy. Helen comes down to the horse and she walks around the horse and she mimics the wives of the Greek heroes, calling out to them. And the heroes have been away by this point for 10 years. And Menelaus, of course, hears Helen's own voice, but two other heroes hear it. And they are about to call out. And Odysseus knows what is happening and he throttles one of the heroes to stop him from calling out.
Like Custer with his dogs before the
very similar.
One of those massacres.
Yeah, not a parallel that I think has ever been made before, but
no,
that's what the podcast is all about. And in due course, Menelaus will blame this not on Helen herself, but on Aphrodite, that Aphrodite has possessed her, and the ability to mimic is traditionally one of Aphrodite's attributes. But I think Helen is very deceptive. She is very manipulative. And we might see that again as kind of misogynist stereotyping. It isn't really. It's giving her the attributes of a god. This is what gods do. Gods do deceive.
Just on that question, is she divine? She's half divine, right?
She is half divine, and we'll come to that. The question of exactly what has, is she mortal? Is she divine? Is she both? Is she we'll come to that. But just sticking to the topic of how Helen behaves badly, she even as she's trying to and the stories are contradictory. On the one hand, she is trying to save Troy by getting the heroes to come out of the horse. But on the other hand, she wants her husband dead and all the Trojans dead. So she has hidden Deiphobus's sword. And the moment she sees the Greeks come out, she says, "Oh, he's in there. Go and kill him." So she seems to have decided by this point that she wants to go back with Menelaus. Now, you may think, Menelaus has become the most notorious cuckold in world mythology. And Helen, by his lights, is responsible for the deaths of thousands and thousands of people. So what's he going to do? And all the sources imply that he's aiming to kill her. And there are vases. It shows Menelaus coming in with his sword upraised. It happens in tragedies. So Euripides, again, who's obsessed by Helen and is always kind of giving various portraits of her. In one of his plays, the Trojan Women, which is kind of completely bleak account of what happens to the women after the sack of Troy, their enslavement, their rape. Menelaus is shown coming in. Helen confronts him, and it's very rare that Helen justifies herself. But basically, her response to Menelaus is to say, it was your fault. You should have looked after me better.
Right.
And then she kind of ends by calling him an idiot.
Yeah.
And you'd think this isn't a great way to stop your husband from killing you. But Menelaus is transfixed by her. And you will see on vases that often Helen is shown adjusting her veil. And it's unclear whether she's covering her beautiful face or whether she is unveiling her hair. But in either way, Menelaus drops his sword in Lysistrata, which is the great comedy by Aristophanes, great women kind of trying to stop the Peloponnesian War. There's a description of Helen's beauty. When Menelaus caught a glimpse of Helen's breasts, naked as they were, then he dropped his sword.
So once again, you have the idea that women have this, through their sexuality, they have
Helen does.
Necromantic power over men, or at least she does.
Because all the other women, they either get killed or enslaved. Helen doesn't. Helen is kept by Menelaus as his queen. They go back to Sparta in the Odyssey, which is the sequel to the Iliad that describes the wanderings of Odysseus for another 10 years. Odysseus' son Telemachus goes to Sparta to ask for help finding his father, and is hosted by Menelaus and Helen. And Helen has this kind of potion which you drink it and it eases pain and grief. So people have said, maybe this is opium or something, but I think that's reductive. I think it's another expression of Helen's more than human powers, that just as she has caused the trauma of bereavement and grief, so fleetingly she has the power to heal it.
your injured, feelings or whatever.
Yeah. And what happens to Helen? There are, again, various accounts. So Pausanias, this gazetteer, he says that there's a temple in Rhodes again, that Helen got seized by the maids of a woman who had died at Troy, and they hang Helen from a tree. But this is very unusual and very late. It is very rare for the death of Helen to be described. So she's hated, she's cursed, she's insulted. But again and again, when people try to kill her, they just find they can't. She's too beautiful. Or the gods intervene. So again, Euripides, in another play, he describes how someone has cornered her, is trying to kill her, and then Helen just vanishes. She's been removed by the gods. They're kind of looking after her. And there is this idea, which is very ancient, that Helen has actually gone to the Elysian fields, so like Russell Crowe. So in the Odyssey, Menelaus is told that if he sticks with Helen, then he will go to the Elysian fields well. And he's told all this is because you are Helen's husband and ranked by the gods as Zeus' son-in-law.
Does he, Tom?
Yeah, he does. I mean, according
he's done
to
very well
tradition.
for such a useless person.
Right, but Greek mythology being Greek mythology, there is an alternative tradition, which again is in Pausanias, the gazetteer, and he says that that Helen ends up married to Achilles, the great warrior who has actually died in the Trojan War.
Right.
And he says that in the Black Sea, opposite the mouth of the Danube, there is an island called Leuce, which means the White Island, and that this is where Achilles lives, and Helen is there, and Helen is his wife. So Achilles is Helen's fifth husband. And in the Roman period, this account is supplemented by a whole load of writers. And have you read Roberto Calasso's Marriage of Cadmus
but
and
I'm aware
Harmony?
of it. Yeah.
Wonderful, weird, haunting account of the Greek myths. And he has a brilliant rendering of all these various Greek writings, so I'll just read it. On leaving the Danube for the open sea, sailors must pass by Leuce, the White Island. They see a coastline of dunes, rocks, and woods. It's an island for castaways and people who want to offer up a sacrifice. No one has ever dared stay there after sundown, and no woman has ever trod its sandy beaches. The only building on the island is a temple with 2 statues, Achilles and Helen. The temple guards are seagulls. Every morning they wet their wings in the sea and sprinkle water on the stones. Achilles lives on the island as Helen's 5th husband. Some have seen him appear in the dazzling armour that once blinded Homer with its brilliance. At night they chant the poetry of Homer in high, clear voices. So that's amazing. I mean, Achilles and Helen are chanting poetry written about themselves. Sometimes, when boats drop anchor off the beach, the sailors hear a drumming of horses' hooves, the clashing of weapons, and the cries of warriors. So this idea of war as something eternal. And what makes this passage, which was written before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, all the more haunting, is that the White Island is the island that is also called Snake Island.
So that was the first day of the war. The Russians attacked, didn't they? And there was a Ukrainian little garrison, and the Russians famously are supposed to have said, surrender or face attack or whatever. And the border guard said, Russian warship, go F yourself. And everyone said, what a tremendous thing this is. Hurrah for Ukraine, all that sort of stuff. And it's actually a very Homeric scene, Tom.
It is a Homeric scene, and it happened on a Homeric place where Achilles and Helen still live.
No blame that the Trojans and strong grieved Greeks have suffered so long on account of such a woman. Terribly does she seem like the immortal goddesses to look on. That was top writer Homer in the Iliad. And there you have the sense, the leading men of Troy sitting on the tower, seeing Helen approaching, the sense of the desire, the kind of yearning, the obsession because of her dazzling beauty, but also, terribly does she seem like the immortal goddesses to look on. The sense that she's frightening, that she is, as we said in the first half, fateful and fatal. And it's not surprising that the elders of Troy, when they see her coming, think to themselves, oh, we're for it now, because this is...
And they actually say we should send her back. Yeah, I mean, they say after this, let's send her back. And then they say, oh, no, let's not. Priam, the king of Troy, says, no, let's keep her.
Again, though, if you were to pick up the theme from the first half, again, you could say this is how men have often seen women's sexuality as both something very desirable and something to be feared. Couldn't you, Tom?
Yeah, I guess so. And Helen, as the most beautiful of all women, obviously kind of raises that to a pitch. And I think it has to be something that is overwhelmingly powerful for the whole story of the Trojan War to make sense. Because the question is, of course, are the Greeks justified? Are the Trojans justified in fighting over her? And I think that is also a part of what makes Helen so interesting to various Greek writers over the sweep of Greek history, is that she provides opportunities for all kinds of writers from different backgrounds and writing in different styles. She gives them material. So we mentioned Sappho, who is a lyric poet, aristocratic. Euripides, we've talked about this tragedian. He is writing in the context of the democracy of Athens. So again, he has a different perspective. And then we quoted Socrates, who's this orator who is writing he lives a very long life. And as a young man, he's in the shadow of the Peloponnesian War, the great war between Athens and Sparta. And, he lives to see the rise of Macedon, which will unleash yet more terrible wars. So you can see the power of Helen as a mythic figure is that she provides scope for all these kind of different writers to kind of do their stuff. And so this question of, are the Greeks justified in fighting her, actually, I think, plays a key role in the birth of history itself. So I would argue, Dominic, that without Helen of Troy, we might not be doing this podcast. So we kind of owe her a lot.
Okay.
So the two great historians who give birth to history, Herodotus and Thucydides. Thucydides, at the beginning of his account of the Peloponnesian War, the great war between the Athenians and the Spartans, he scorns the very idea that the Greek princes had sworn an oath to get Helen back. I mean, he just says this is mad. This is a kind of, a children's story. And he's very Sandbrook. He takes for granted that the war is a consequence of great power politics and of money. It's it's fought over material causes.
I'm glad that I now apparently own that way of looking at history, Tom. That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And it sets the template for Thucydides' entire take on history, which is that it is all about, I guess, the masculine pursuits of war and politics.
I'm distancing myself from that because that's not how I do
Understood. And this is why in Thucydides, I mean, Helen is one of only 20 women who were mentioned by name. And his history is very, very long.
He wouldn't
there are
have
very, very few women.
He wouldn't have written about 60s fashion, would he? About the rise of the miniskirts.
No, he would very much not have done that. But I tell you who would.
Yeah.
And that's Herodotus. Herodotus would have loved all that stuff.
Yeah.
So Herodotus is the first historian. And his work, so this is the first work of history ever written, he begins with, in the way that Thucydides will do as well, a kind of demythologization of Helen, because he's trying to explain why the Greeks have gone to war with the Persian Empire in the 5th century BC. And he begins by giving the Persian perspective. And the Persian perspective, Herodotus reports, is that Helen was actually just a number of women who were abducted by pirates coming to Greece and stealing women, and Greek pirates going to Asia and stealing women from there. Kind of a bout of competitive princess rustling, Herodotus calls it. And there's no mention of Helen's beauty. The Persians just emphasize that the Greeks have massively, massively overreacted to her abduction. And so what the Persians are doing by denying that Helen has any supernatural quality of beauty is to make the Trojan War just look like any other war. It's nothing special. There's nothing mythical about it. There's nothing kind of supernatural.
I mean, to be fair, there must have been lots of wars and there must have been lots of violence along that seaboard, because there are all these states and cities that are trading with each other. So the Persians surely are just employing common sense.
Well, so that would very much be how Herodotus would frame the Persian perspective. I mean, he's saying that the Trojan War was nothing special, that it was just a kind of sequence of endless tit for tat conflicts, and it was ridiculous for the Greeks to overreact just because somebody stole a woman from them. So that is how Herodotus is framing the Persian take on it. But he hasn't finished with Helen, because there are two more perspectives that he offers later in his history. So the first is a very, very weird aspect of Helen's story, which is that actually she never went to the Trojan War at all. That she spent the whole period of the Trojan War in Egypt. And Herodotus gives an Egyptian account, he says, that this is what happened. That Paris had taken Helen, behaved very badly, and that, in the opinion of the Egyptians, the Greeks were right to go and get her back. But that Paris and Helen, when they were going to Troy, had been blown off course, had ended up in Egypt, and the pharaoh had been so appalled by what Paris had done that he wouldn't let him leave without keeping Helen himself. So this is why Helen spends the whole time. And in due course, Menelaus comes and picks her up after the Trojan War and goes back to Sparta. And Herodotus says, well, you may wonder why Homer doesn't mention this, if this is what happened. And he says, well, Homer doesn't mention it because it wouldn't have made for a kind of epic quality for his poem. So basically he's not revealing the actual truth because it makes a better story to imagine that Helen actually was in Troy.
Can I ask a quick question about Herodotus? Does Herodotus think this actually happened? By which I mean, does Herodotus believe that Helen of Troy is a historical figure rather than purely a mythological one?
Yes, he does. He never doubts that. The Persians, he's ventriloquizing the Persians, they accept Helen existed. The Egyptians, they accept Helen existed. But what he is doing is giving multiple perspectives on who Helen was.
So interestingly, Herodotus thinks that Homer has fictionalized what was previously a factual story.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
And you may wonder, well, if Helen spent the whole time in Egypt, why were the Greeks and the Trojans fighting?
Yeah, mugs.
If she was never there. And the answer to this, which gets teased out in a lot of a lot of dramas, Euripides inevitably being to the fore, is that the gods created what was called an eidolon, which is a kind of an image of Helen conjured up out of cloud and smoke that looks exactly like her, and that therefore, she's a phantasm. The Helen who is fought over at Troy is a phantasm, and it kind of makes it even worse. They're not even fighting over Helen; they're fighting over a fantasy of Helen.
Yeah.
So that is Herodotus's kind of refinement of the Persian position by giving the Egyptian position, but then finally he gives the Spartan position. What do the Spartans think of Helen? And Herodotus reports that there's a place called Therapne just outside Sparta, and that the Spartans, whose daughters are invariably beautiful, Spartan girls are famously beautiful, that if a child is born, a girl is born who is ugly, the nurse will take the girl up to the shrine of Therapne. And he gives a specific instance of this. The daughter of a king, baby daughter, gets taken up, and the nurse meets a woman there who is veiled, and the woman says, "Show me the child," and the nurse refuses, and the woman insists over and over again, until finally the nurse hands the baby girl over to the nurse, and the mysterious woman strokes the girl's head and then says, "You will be the fairest woman in Sparta." And sure enough, the girl grows up to be the fairest woman in Sparta. And it's clear that this woman is Helen. And it's very strange because Helen is playing the role of a god. And it is a direct contradiction to the Persian perspective, which is saying she's just a woman. In the Spartan perspective, Helen is not just the most beautiful woman who's ever lived, but she is divine. And it is just one of a number of markers of Spartan devotion to Helen as almost a goddess. So there's the fragments of the egg, which we talked about, which are kept on the Acropolis. There's a shrine dedicated not just to Helen herself, but to one of her sandals, which supposedly fell off in the elopement.
Yeah.
She, in a battle the Spartans are said to have fought, she appears alongside her brothers, Castor and Pollux, to help inspire the Spartans to victory. And you mentioned before whether the story of Theseus abducting Helen was merely a product of the Peloponnesian War, of the rivalry between Athens and Sparta. I think not, because there is a story told that when the Spartans invade Attica, they burn everything and they attack every town except for a place called Decelea. And the story is that they do this because it was the Deceleans who had told Castor and Pollux where their sister was to be found. And so this is a tribute to it.
So just on this thing about Helen and her divine powers or whatever, how normal is this for somebody who's reputed to be the child of a mortal and an immortal? So normally, do those people have divine powers, or normally are they ranked with mortals?
They're normally ranked with mortals. There is a masculine counterpoint, which is Heracles, who is also a son of Zeus, the kind of like the most masculine of men in the way that Helen is the most feminine of women. Heracles is the strongest of men, and in the end he becomes a god and sits in Olympus. And Helen is clearly the female counterpart to that, but it's important to emphasize that there are lots of heroes who have shrines to them, very few women. So in that sense, Helen really is someone unique. And and we don't have stories really, apart from very late ones, of her ever dying. And so I think that there are scholars who say that perhaps Helen was always a goddess, that she's a goddess who kind of becomes mortalized. But if that is the case, then there's nothing actually in the ancient sources that suggests that. So I think it's probably
right. You don't believe that? You don't believe that that's...
No, I don't. I think that just as Helen's beauty drives men mad in the myths, I think she's an object of such fascination, and to women as well as men. So that story of the nurse taking the baby up, she's such the idea of a woman with such power it's so interesting to people that they think her attributes must be those of a goddess. And so the more that stories are told about her, the more she comes to take on kind of divine attributes.
Oh, I see.
And qualities that in a mortal might be condemned, kind of rushing off with, strange men or whatever. In a goddess, that's the kind of thing goddesses would do. And so it kind of removes Helen from the dimensions of the traditional standards of judgment that are applied to women.
So hold on, Tom. You think she began? So where did she begin? I know you're going to say you don't know, but I'm asking you to speculate. Did she begin as a character simply in a story who over time took on more and more semi-divine attributes as the story was told and retold?
Yeah,
I
think so.
You think that's how? And do you think she began purely as a male fantasy figure in stories? Or do you think...
No, well, we'll come to who the historical Helen might have been in due course. But I think she is clearly, even by the time Homer is writing about her, she is already very firmly established as a figure that everyone knows about. That's why Homer doesn't need to explain who she is. And I think the idea of the most beautiful woman in the world who has a power over men that is of a divine order, I think that appeals to something very profound in the way the Greeks understand the cosmos.
Greek
and the
men
universe.
Understand the cosmos.
Well, women as well. Because Sappho responds to it.
Okay,
but
fine.
yeah, but and kind of a fascinating example of the way in which Helen comes to seem like a kind of, to be jealous and angry like a god. There's a poet called Stesichorus, and he writes abusive poetry about Helen, calling her a prostitute and adulteress and so on. And so she blinds him as punishment. And, as she had blinded Homer, who supposedly was blind. But Stesichorus is a favorite of the Muses. And so he understands, unlike Homer, he understands why he's been struck blind. And so he composes these lines. The story I told is not true. He's addressing Helen. You did not go in the well-bent ships. You did not reach the citadel of Troy. So he again is saying Helen never went to Troy. He's basically saying all the stories that are told about Helen are not true. But he's doing this because he knows that Helen is a figure so powerful that she can blind him. And this is what gods do. So I think this is part of what makes Helen so fascinating to the Greeks, is the idea of a woman who stands midway between the human and the divine. And it comes to express itself in very weird ways. So there's a sect of Pythagoreans who basically think she's an alien. So they say that she comes from the moon, and that on the moon there's a colony of humans who are kind of infinitely more beautiful, infinitely larger, infinitely stronger than mortals down on Earth, and that this is why Helen is so beautiful. So, that's a kind of very weird idea, and it feeds... You get an echo of that. Dan Simmons, the great science fiction writer, he wrote a couple of books, Ilium and Olympus, in which the Trojan War is restaged, and Helen is, again, she's a figure of beauty conjured up by science by that point. But you get a prefiguring of that even in classical antiquity. Yeah. And I think that it's another marker of Helen's power, that you don't need to believe in the Greek gods to be obsessed by her. The stories of Helen continue to be told right the way through the Christian era. Marlowe is doing it. Yeats is doing it. Yeah. And Helen comes to obsess people. And you were asking, was there a real Helen? Of course, into the 19th century, when archaeology as a discipline is starting to be developed, the question of was Helen real leads to the most famous obsession in the history of archaeology, kind of ranking alongside Howard Carter's discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun, which is the German businessman turned archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century, who is so besotted by the idea that Helen might have existed and that the Trojan War might actually have been fought over her, that he sets himself the task of going to the site of Troy and trying to find it. So Schliemann he was the son of a Lutheran pastor who got caught up in a sex scandal.
Oh no!
And so the young Heinrich was kind of impoverished and humiliated, but discovered that he had an incredible aptitude for languages, and ended up a fabulously wealthy businessman. And became obsessed by the story of the Trojan War. He was very good at fabricating his own image, and he wrote that he had been obsessed with Troy and with Helen since the age of 7. The likelihood is that this isn't actually true,
Right?
because Schliemann is a kind of he's a man of remarkable vision and energy, but he's also a kind of monster on the scale of Wagner, or maybe even the Kaiser. I mean, he's a kind of...
Oh no! Can't believe you're bad-mouthing the Kaiser.
He is a product of Germany at its most expansionist, self-confident, but also kind of insecure. He's a fascinating figure. So Schliemann would later claim that back when he was a child in Mecklenburg in East Germany, Dominic, he had been reading about Troy and Helen as a 7-year-old. This is probably not true. Schliemann is brilliant at creating his own mythology, ironically enough. He's a kind of great monstrous figure of high achievement, high ambition, kind of almost Wagnerian character, but he's not always 100% truthful. And Helen is a kind of obsession for him. And just as the Greek heroes go and search for Helen, so does Schliemann. And this obsession is so great that in 1869 he's been married to a Russian woman. Russian was one of his many languages, and he'd been working in St. Petersburg. He divorces her, and he decides that he'd like a real life Helen to replace her. And so amazingly, he employs a Greek archbishop basically to pimp him a suitable Helen. And the archbishop finds one in the form of a 16-year-old Greek girl who's called Sophia. And Schliemann has specified that she has to be poor and she has to be educated. And so he interviews her and asks her to recite Homer, and Sophia does. And so the marriage goes ahead. So he has his own Helen in the form of Sophia. The following year in 1870, he goes to the northwestern corner of what is now Turkey, where tradition placed the site of Troy. And he starts excavating a hill called Hissarlik. And he's there for 2 years. And in 1872, he announces that he has found a burnt city, which he identifies with the very Troy burnt by the Greeks. And then the following year, in May, he finds a spectacular hoard of gold and silver. And among this hoard, there's a great collection of jewelry, which he calls inevitably the jewels of Helen. And Schliemann tells a story about how Sophia had been with him, how she had carried the jewels from the site where they'd found them in her skirts. This is, again, not true. Sophia had been in Athens at the time. But what Schliemann then does is to dress her up in the jewels, and to say that he has found the treasure of Priam, the king of Troy, that these are definitely the jewels of heaven. And it's absolutely brilliant. He seems to have discovered Helen of Troy.
Yeah.
Now, Helen, of course, was only one of 2 sisters who were hatched by Leda, their mother. Mm-hmm. So we talked about this, Dominic, in the previous episode, how Leda was raped by Zeus in the form of a giant swan, and gave birth to Helen, who was Zeus's daughter, and gave birth to Clytemnestra, who was the daughter of Leda's mortal husband, Tyndareus, the king of Sparta. And we talked as well about how Clytemnestra married the elder brother of Menelaus, who was called Agamemnon. And Agamemnon is the king of a Greek city called Mycenae, mm-hmm. where Clytemnestra rules as the queen. And so Schliemann, having, in his opinion, discovered Troy, discovered the jewels of Helen, having proven that Helen had actually existed, the obvious target for his next excavation would be Mycenae, the city ruled by Agamemnon, where Helen's sister, Clytemnestra, was queen. And so that's what he decides to do. There's a problem with this because the Greeks, Greece is now an independent state, so it's not kind of Lord Elgin conditions where he could just turn up and do it. So in 1874, he heads to the Peloponnese, which is the kind of the fork that sticks onto it's the southern bit of Greece.
Yeah, the southern peninsula.
And he heads to Mycenae, which is kind of in the what is it? It's the northeast corner of it, kind of set among mountains. And he starts this completely illegal dig, and the Greeks close it down. So Schliemann gets around this problem by giving a massive bung to the Greek Archaeological Society, who then decide, yeah, that's great, you can go ahead. And so he starts excavating in this site. And I think there's no question that just as at Troy, he was looking for Helen, so in a sense, at Mycenae, Schliemann is looking for certainly Agamemnon, the king there, but also his wife, Clytemnestra. So although Clytemnestra is not as celebrated as Helen of Troy, I mean, she is a significant figure in Greek mythology, and particularly in the literature of democratic Athens in its 5th century BC heyday. And she is the dominant figure in one of the supreme literary achievements of ancient Athens, which is a series of 3 plays by a tragedian called Aeschylus. And Aeschylus was a veteran of the Persian Wars. He'd fought at Marathon. He'd fought at Salamis. Every year he would enter a play for the annual contest that the Athenians staged in honor of Dionysus, and he would always he'd always win. And eventually he got killed. According to tradition, he was very bald, and an eagle is supposed to have dropped a tortoise on his head.
Why would that kill you? More likely to kill you if you were bald than if you had a normal
because
head
the
of
eagle
hair.
thought that his bald head was a stone.
Oh, okay.
So
fair enough.
So just tipping you off there to
Thank you.
beware of eagles carrying
Thank
tortoises,
you.
Dominic. And he's commemorated as one of the giant figures of classical Athens. And the play that describes Clytemnestra's relationship with Agamemnon in the most detail, and it has to be said the most bloody detail, was called the Agamemnon. And it was part of this trilogy, as I said, that in 458 BC won the top prize. And just as Homer, when he introduces Helen, takes for granted that people will know who Helen is, so to a degree, Aeschylus is able to take for granted that people will know who Clytemnestra is and who Agamemnon is and what the backdrop to their story is. So I think before we continue with our account of what Schliemann finds in Mycenae, we should perhaps just go into the details of who Clytemnestra is and what the family is that she's married into, because it has to be said, it is probably the most nightmarish collection of in-laws that anyone could possibly have.
So to recap for those people who maybe didn't hear the last episode or forgotten, Clytemnestra herself is the daughter of Leda, the queen of Sparta, and Zeus, who molested her mother in the form of a swan, and she is the sister of Helen and Castor and Pollux. And she has married into Agamemnon's family. So, Tom, who are Agamemnon's forebears?
So, Agamemnon's great-grandfather is a guy called Tantalus, who is the son of Zeus, and he hosts the gods for a great banquet. And basically, just for the bants, he cooks his son, a boy called Pelops, and serves him up in the banquet to see whether the gods will be able to tell his trick. And the gods all do find this, but one of them, Demeter, because she's lost her daughter Persephone to the god of the underworld, is very depressed. So she nibbles and nibbles on the feast and eats Pelops' shoulder. And the gods are incredibly angry. They bring Pelops back to life. They give him a shoulder made of ivory, and they put Tantalus in the depths of hell, where he's surrounded by water which he can't drink.
He's being
and
tantalized.
By grapes. Yeah, Tom. Grapes which are always out of reach. So he's tantalized. Pelops, his son, we've actually already mentioned him. He's the guy who founds the Olympic Games, and he gives his name to the Peloponnese, the island of Pelops. And he has won the daughter of the king of Olympia by cheating. He's entered a chariot race with this king, and the king's charioteer has been bribed by Pelops to replace the axle with wax so that the wheels go bouncing off. The king gets killed. And after the race, the charioteer approaches Pelops for his reward, and Pelops tells him basically to bog off. So the charioteer curses Pelops. So that's two layers of curses. We've got Tartarus and we've got Pelops. Pelops has various children, two of whom are called Atreus and Thyestes. And Atreus and Thyestes kill one of their half-brothers because they want him out of the way. And Pelops is furious about this, as he would be, and exiles them. And they go off to Mycenae, conquer it, and they both rule it. But Atreus wants Thyestes out of the way. And so, following in the footsteps of his grandfather, he takes Thyestes' children, cooks them, puts them in a dish, and gives them to Thyestes for dinner. And Thyestes, because he's not a god, doesn't realize what he's being served, so goes ahead and eats them.
Yeah.
And after he's eaten them, Atreus brandishes their heads and hands and feet, has a good laugh about it. And of course, Thyestes is, I mean, to add insult to injury, not only has he eaten his own children, but he has to go into exile because he's guilty of cannibalism.
Yeah, he's the real victim in all this. Very sad.
Well, yeah, I mean, completely. So he's obviously very cross about this. So he goes to Delphi, the oracle of Apollo. And Apollo offers him some terrible advice. So Apollo says that that what he should do to get back at Atreus is to disguise himself and to rape his own daughter.
His own daughter?
His own daughter. So he does this. The daughter doesn't realize who the rapist is. She gives birth to a son.
She doesn't recognize her own father?
Because he's disguised. That's the point.
A hell of a disguise. Anyway, continue. Yeah.
She gives birth to this boy who she calls Aegisthus, and she's so traumatized by the fact that this boy is the son of rape that she exposes him on the mountainside, where, as always happens in these stories, he gets rescued by shepherds,
Always
and by a long process of improbable coincidences, he ends up as the foster brother of Agamemnon and Menelaus in Mycenae, because they are the sons of Atreus. So there is Atreus. He's got his two sons, Agamemnon and Menelaus, and he's got Aegisthus, who is the son of the brother who he has treated so appallingly. In due course, Aegisthus discovers his true paternity and kills Atreus, and he drives Agamemnon and Menelaus out of Mycenae.
Right.
And they go to Sparta. And this is when Menelaus manages to win Helen. So I said in the first episode, Menelaus doesn't have a palace to take Helen to. This is why. He's in
exile. Yeah.
He's in exile. And this is also when Agamemnon marries Clytemnestra. So you have these two brothers who are married to the two sisters.
Okay, it's going to be a quiz at the end of this episode.
Agamemnon and Menelaus then lead an army, kick Aegisthus out of Mycenae, and they seize control of it. And that is the state of play when Helen is abducted by Paris.
So they're back in situ.
They're back in situ.
They are back in Mycenae.
I mean, it's complicated. Greek murderous stories of cannibalism and incest always are. But basically, there's been a lot of very, very bad behavior. And it means that Agamemnon and Menelaus have inherited 3 generations worth of monstrous behavior by their forebears. And so they are operating under a terrible curse. And particularly Agamemnon is, because he is now, with the death of Atreus, he is the head of the family. He is the king of Mycenae. Now, as king of Mycenae, he proves a brilliant king. He establishes Mycenae as the most powerful state in the whole of Greece. He is described by Homer as Anax Andron, lord of men, wide ruling. And this is great for Clytemnestra. You know, she's queen of the most powerful man in Greece, and they have various children, of whom the eldest is a daughter called Iphigenia. Then they have another daughter called Electra, and they have a son called Orestes. Then the abduction of Helen happens, and Agamemnon like all the other Greeks, is obliged to help Menelaus get Helen back. And all the Greek forces gather at a place called Aulis, which is kind of north of where Athens is, on the coast. And Agamemnon goes out hunting, and he's hunting this deer, and the deer takes refuge in a grove that is sacred to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. And Agamemnon goes in and he kills the deer. And Artemis is furious about this.
So she sends bad winds, doesn't she?
So the fleet can't leave. Yeah, exactly. And the Greek fleet is stuck in Aulis. And having been to Aulis, there's a massive cement works there. So it's not a place that you would want to be stuck at all. Agamemnon is told by the soothsayer who is accompanying the Greeks that, there'd be so many children killed in the story. He's told the only way that the winds will change is if you sacrifice your own daughter, Iphigenia, to Artemis. And Agamemnon knows that Clytemnestra will not allow this to happen. She's devoted to her daughters. And so Agamemnon tricks Clytemnestra by saying, we're going to marry Iphigenia to Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors. And Clytemnestra and Iphigenia are thrilled about this. And so Clytemnestra brings Iphigenia to Aulis. And when she arrives there, Iphigenia is seized and she is sacrificed. And the winds promptly change. And Agamemnon and all the Greeks are able to sail off to Troy. And Clytemnestra is left completely distraught. And not just distraught, but set on revenge. And so while Agamemnon is in Greece, she decides that she will shack up with the one man who is pledged to eternal enmity to Agamemnon, which is Aegisthus.
Yes. So that, for those people who have completely who haven't been making notes, so Aegisthus is Agamemnon's cousin,
yeah,
who was himself the son of his grandfather and his grandfather. His grandfather is also his father. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Who slept with his own daughter, and he is now shacked up with Clytemnestra, who is the
in Mycenae.
In Mycenae, she is the daughter of Zeus, and she has just seen her own daughter sacrificed by her husband, who is this bloke's cousin.
In due course, what happens is that Troy falls and watchtowers are lit, and the blaze of the watchtowers are seen in Mycenae. And Clytemnestra knows, therefore, that Agamemnon is coming back.
Yeah.
This is where Aeschylus's great play begins, with the blaze of the watchtowers, the news Troy has fallen. And to begin with, it seems as though Clytemnestra is overjoyed by this. She says, wonderful, my husband is coming back. Can't wait. Agamemnon comes back. He's driving a chariot. Behind him is a daughter of the king of Priam called Cassandra, who had been much loved by Apollo, and Apollo had given her the gift of prophecy. But Cassandra had then turned Apollo down. And so Apollo had cursed her by saying that although she had the ability to see the future, no one would ever believe her.
Yeah.
And Agamemnon has seized her and made her his concubine. So, I mean, Agamemnon really is asking for trouble. He's killed his own daughter. He's deceived his wife, and he's now returned with a slave girl in tow. But Clytemnestra pretends to be absolutely thrilled. She says, I've been tending the home fires. I've been completely faithful. Lovely to have you back. Absolutely brilliant. And look, I have all these wonderful purple robes. Why don't you enter the palace stepping onto these robes? And Agamemnon is nervous because he knows that this is the kind of thing that might anger the gods. And so he's reluctant. But Clytemnestra urges him and urges him. And finally he says, okay, I will. And so he steps onto the robes and goes inside. But before he's gone inside, he asks that Cassandra be well looked after. And so Cassandra addresses the chorus, addresses the watching people. And because she has the powers of prophecy, she knows what is going to happen. So she says, oh my God, Agamemnon is going to be killed. And then she too vanishes into the palace. And in Aeschylus's play, you hear kind of screams, Agamemnon crying out, and then Clytemnestra comes out covered in blood. Yes, this is my work, and I claim it. To prevent flight or resistance foiling death, I cast on him as one who catches fish a vast voluminous net that walled him round with endless wealth of woven folds, and then I struck him twice. Twice he cried out and groaned, and then fell limp. And as he lay, I gave a third and final blow, my thanks for prayers fulfilled to Zeus. So falling, he belched forth his life. With cough and retch there spurted from him bloody foam in a fierce jet, and spreading, spattered me with drops of crimson rain. Just for good measure, Cassandra too has been murdered. And then who should come out of the palace but Aegisthus? So he's been
there the whole time.
He's been hanging out the whole time. Yeah. Claims it was his plan, celebrates his vengeance, and he and Clytemnestra say, brilliant, we're now going to rule in Agamemnon's place. And Clytemnestra says, this was vengeance for the murder of Iphigenia. So, brilliant. And that is where the play ends.
Yeah. But of course, that's just the beginning of this huge cycle of vengeance, which people who are familiar with Greek tragedy will know, because their children, their surviving children, decide that they are going to get revenge on their own mother. It's nice.
Well, it's a terrible situation to be in, isn't it? Your mother's killed your father. And not only that, but you have Apollo, the god of prophecy, who is not a god you want to ignore, basically telling you to go and kill your mother. So this is the second play, the Libation Bearers, it's called. Orestes, the son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, has gone to Delphi, and Apollo has basically said, you have to go and kill your mother. And so he does that. He kills Aegisthus and he kills Clytemnestra. But to kill your mother is the worst of crimes. And there are very, very ancient divinities, older than the gods on Olympus, who lurk in the depths of the earth, whose role it is to punish those who break the natural order. And there is no greater crime against the natural order than to kill your own mother. And so the moment Orestes has killed Clytemnestra, these terrible monsters appear, and they're called Furies. They have snakes for hair. They carry whips. They're kind of monstrous and loathsome in appearance. And Orestes has no choice but to flee them. And so this seems to be his fate, that for the rest of his existence, he will be pursued by these Furies with their whips. And this is what is happening in the third play, the Eumenides, which in Greek means the kindly ones. It opens with Orestes is able to, he's snatched a brief moment to consult Apollo again, because Apollo has put the Furies to sleep. And this gives him the chance to kind of give them the slip, and Orestes heads for Athens. The Furies are snoring, and the ghost of Clytemnestra appears. So Clytemnestra is the only figure who appears in all three of these plays. The Furies head off to Athens to get Orestes. That's their job. And they corner Orestes there. And Orestes begs Athena for help. And Athena appears. And she introduces something very novel and radical, something that Greece and the world until that moment had not seen, which is a courtroom.
Right, so it's the world's first courtroom trial.
Athena says, this is what we're going to do. We'll get a jury, we'll get various mortals who will decide whether Orestes should be let off or not. The Furies don't like it, but they accept it. They can't argue with Athena. And at the end of the trial, the jury is hung. And so the casting vote is with Athena. And she says, I'm going to let him off. And the Furies are absolutely indignant. But Athena says, you've got to accept it, that we're going to have this new legal order. We can't have people committing crimes and then being chased by kind of monsters with whips. This is no basis for a stable civic society. So from this point on, we're going to have law courts and all this kind of thing. But you can be the guardians of it. And by doing that, you will be showing how kind you are, which is why henceforward you will no longer be called the Furies, but the Eumenides, the kindly ones. So that's where the name of the play comes from. And it's a kind of brilliant maneuver by Aeschylus, because basically he's saying that these these ancient epic cycles of bloodshed and revenge, which has been rippling through generation after generation after generation, it is stopped and eased, not just in Athens, but in an Athens that has the institutions of democratic government.
So it's the story symbolizes the transition from a world of blood feuds and vengeance passed down the generations to one in which a law court, so in this case there's a law court, it's the Areopagus, isn't it? The sort of elite,
the Hill of Ares,
the elders of Athens. So they are judging cases. So that's what the story is dramatizing, is that right?
It is I think it is dramatizing an idea that the old world of kind of epic violence has faded and been succeeded by a better order. But it's obviously specifically making Athens and its democracy look good. And it's specifically, there's been a kind of there have been all these kind of convulsions in Athens. The frameworks of democracy are in the process of being set up and revised. And Aeschylus is basically saying that this quite novel legal framework, rather than just having been invented recently, actually reaches back to the legendary ages, of Agamemnon and so on. And it's a kind of classic. So Aeschylus himself said that his plays were slices cut from the great feast of Homer. And it's a perfect example of how these figures like Helen, like Clytemnestra, that they can be used by writers to channel understandings of revolutionary processes within Greek society and to tame it. And it kind of opens up the obvious question, which really Schliemann is trying to answer, which is that what Homer did? So just as Aeschylus is using Homer and adapting it, was Homer doing the same? Was he taking much older stories and adapting them? And if he was doing that, then is it possible that Clytemnestra and Helen were actual real people?
Yeah.
And Schliemann, to his own satisfaction, has proved that Helen was a real person. But now that he's arrived at Mycenae and he's had permission from the Greek government to excavate there, his goal is to try and see whether Clytemnestra and Agamemnon are also real.
This corpse very much resembles the image which my imagination formed long ago of wide-ruling Agamemnon. So you may remember that at the beginning of the episode we talked about how Heinrich Schliemann, having been to Troy, has got permission to excavate at Mycenae. And this is the telegram that he sent in 1876 to a Greek newspaper once he'd got to Mycenae and got to work. And this was later abbreviated. It was kind of condensed to the sentence, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." And if you're at all familiar with ancient Greece and with archaeology and stuff, you will no doubt have seen that image of the gold mask, which is now, if you Google Agamemnon, the gold mask that Schliemann found is what comes up, and that is generally taken as Agamemnon's mask, even though there's no evidence, of course, that it was. Or was it, Tom?
Just to emphasize that there's a difference between Mycenae and Troy. Troy had been forgotten about. Nobody knew where it was. People always knew where Mycenae was. And people had already begun excavating there. So as early as 1700, a Venetian engineer had gone and he had removed all the kind of debris that had slid down the mountain and buried Mycenae. And actually, Lord Elgin had gone there, and the gateway into Mycenae, it's called the Lion Gate. It has two images of lions over it, although actually they're not lions, they're lionesses, which is appropriate, bearing in mind that it was the home of Clytemnestra. And he wanted to take that back to the British Museum as well, but he couldn't because it is enormous.
Yeah.
I mean, the Mycenae is built out of the most enormous stones. And so even the Greeks were impressed. They called it Cyclopean. So the Cyclops are kind of giant one-eyed monsters who were supposed to have built it. So it's not as though Schliemann is dealing archaeologically with entirely virgin territory when he starts digging there in 1876. But he does have a nose for the incredible find. And what he's done is that he's kind of just to the right of the Lion Gate, inside the great walls of Mycenae, he's found a circle of stone slabs. And within it, there's this kind of series of weird upright stones, and some of these have relief sculptures. And Schliemann, the moment he finds these, he says, brilliant, I found the tombs of Agamemnon and Cassandra. So he's immediately identifying his archaeological finds with the stories that he's read in Aeschylus and so on. But even better, he finds these very, very kind of deep shaft graves beneath the tombstones. And he excavates these, and in each of these tombs, he finds bodies, sometimes he finds treasure, he finds all kinds of stuff, and some of the bodies are wearing masks. And it's in the final shaft that he finds the famous mask, which, you know, the one of gold, which is always called the face of Agamemnon. But the thing is that this isn't actually what Schliemann meant. What he actually was referring to was not the mask, but to a head that had survived, a kind of skull that had survived. And he did a drawing of it. And it appeared in the book that he published about his excavations at Mycenae, and it looks like E.T. I mean,
it's 3,000 years old, right? I mean, or whatever, however many thousand years old. How old is it? Would it be?
Well, it's actually older than Schliemann thought, because Schliemann thought that it was dated to around 1250 BC, which is the date of the Trojan War, but it's actually about 400 years older than that. So even if Agamemnon had existed, it wasn't Agamemnon, and this gets discovered in the wake of Schliemann's finds, because basically in the wake of Schliemann, archaeology begins to kind of professionalize itself. And over the course of the 20th century, kind of academic archaeologists come to feel really embarrassed about the idea that you're going to these places to look for legendary figures. But also, of course, in the wake of the Second World War, there are further reasons, which is that you know, the emphasis on Helen being white and golden haired, and the Agamemnon as a great ruler of men. This had been very strongly eulogized by Nazis, among others.
There was I forgot. The Nazis thought that the ancient Greeks were good Aryans, didn't they?
Yeah, so there was a definite sense that kind of looking for these legendary figures of Greek myth was kind of incipiently Nazi. And also the other thing that happens is that the language used by the Mycenaeans, what's called Linear B, gets cracked, and people can start reading what is on all the kind of burnt tablets that have been found at various cities like Mycenae across Greece. And it opens up a world not of Homeric warriors, but of bureaucrats. And you get records of kind of farmers and potters and weavers and so on. And you know, there's nothing about
fighting
golden-haired warriors in chariots or anything like that. And this contributes to a sense after the Second World War that it's somehow kind of politically the wrong thing to do, not just to emphasize on Homeric warriors, but on the very idea of warriors.
Yes, it's exactly as it is with the Vikings, right? It's all about multicultural trading links and you know, rethinking gender roles and celebrating migration. And actually, what everybody's itching to say is, what about the stuff about smashing people's heads in with axes? Where's all that? That's the stuff. That's the fun stuff.
Well, I mean, most obviously, the fact that you've got these enormous fortifications built out of colossal, giant cyclopean boulders.
Right.
And so you have a very, very... So there's a wonderful book on this whole process by a scholar called Kathy Gear about the kind of the way that Mycenae has been understood. And she quotes a very distinguished scholar who says that the citadels in Mycenae and other such cities served as symbols of the exalted status and the power of their rulers rather than as fortresses. And that even though these fortresses are marked by cycles of destruction and rebuilding and then destruction again, that actually this is due to earthquakes and not to kind of violent conflict. So in a sense, it's standing the whole Schliemann-esque idea that he has found evidence for the Trojan War on its head. There was no Trojan War. The Mycenaeans were not kind of brutal warlords. It was all international trading and bureaucracy and weaving and so on. But it has to be said that I think the pendulum on that has swung back pretty hard. That kind of 60s idea that ancient peoples were all, all about beads and things.
Right. You're not building those big walls just for fun. You're building them because there are some other people over the other hill who want to kill you. Surely.
Right. Well, so Kathy Gear again, she quotes another scholar responding to this idea that the marks of destruction in Mycenaean cities were caused by earthquakes. She said, "Yeah, right. The building of massive cyclopean walls is not a useful response to an earthquake." And of course, I mean, she's entirely true. And what has been happening, I think, over the past decades. I mean, it's not exactly saying that Schliemann was right, that he'd found the Troy that was destroyed by the Greeks in the Trojan War, but that it is all rooted in a much more kind of solid foundations of historicity than perhaps people had thought about 40 or 50 years ago. And one of the key influences on this is that a whole load of texts from an empire to the east of Troy in what's now Turkey called the Hittite Empire, that loads of these have been found, and they're being kind of translated. I mean, the translation is ongoing, and it kind of portrays a world of great power politics that actually does seem to kind of meld with the idea of there having been a Trojan War. And it does kind of suggest that perhaps Troy is a kind of buffer state between the empires of the Hittites and the empires of the Achaewa, which might be the Achaeans, which is the name that Homer gives to the Greeks in his epics, and that maybe that was what was going on. And I think also archaeology has demonstrated that the portrayal of Greek kingdoms in Homer kind of does map onto the evidence from the Bronze Age. It does seem to be an authentic record of which cities were significant, which ones weren't. And we know from the tablets that these kingdoms were ruled by, a man called a Wanax. And that's not so far from Homer's word, anax.
Okay.
So you can kind of see where the derivation of Agamemnon's title as Anax Androne, the ruler of men, that it might have come authentically from the Bronze Age. So that's the men. But of course,
what about the women? Because the women at the core of our story.
Helen?
What do we know? And having taken into account Schliemann and also the developments in academic thinking about all this, Tom, where are we with Helen and with her sister Clytemnestra?
So by far the most readable and enjoyable study of how Helen herself might have been rooted in memories of how women in the Bronze Age queens might have lived is Bettany Hughes's book on Helen of Troy, which I mentioned in the first episode. And she kind of makes her case at the opening of her book. Because Helen is such an alluring figure of fantasy, because she dazzles as she goes, she can make it hard to see the women of substance who walked through the Bronze Age palaces of the Eastern Mediterranean. But ongoing archaeological and historical projects demonstrate that these women were prominent and significant.
Okay.
And I think she absolutely makes her case about that. By going through the evidence and looking specifically for evidence of queens. I mean, women like Helen and Clytemnestra are not apparent in, say, the 5th century BC. That's the whole point of Aeschylus's play, that the age where monstrous women like Clytemnestra could sway the destiny of a state, that is long gone in the past. But if you look back to the evidence in the Bronze Age, I think you do find that queens did have a kind of elevated role. So Bettany kind of adduces all kinds of evidence. So Bettany's making the case specifically for Helen. And I think she does adduce fascinating evidence for how the traditions that are told about Helen might have originated in kind of authentic Bronze Age practices. But just looking at it slightly broader before we zoom in on Helen. So looking at Mycenae, for instance, the home of Clytemnestra, it is absolutely clear from the archaeology that women were present in the citadel. And also that just as Clytemnestra is portrayed in Homer and in Aeschylus, they lived in unsegregated ways. So Agamemnon and Clytemnestra could absolutely be imagined going into the bathroom together, as Aeschylus portrays
And we
them.
know that because their artifacts are found together and they're buried together, things like that.
Well, there's one room in particular in Mycenae where there's evidence of weaving. So that is a marker of women, but there are also kind of arrowheads there. So that suggests a kind of mixing of male and female going on. And as you say, also there is no segregation in death. So these shaft graves excavated by Schliemann, there are female bodies as well as male bodies. Although the women don't have masks, they kind of have strips of gold diadems on their heads, and kind of broadening it out to look at kind of some of the things that you get in Homeric epic. So the idea that the abduction of women might be a cause for war, there seems to be evidence for that in some of the Hittite tablets. There's definitely evidence for high-ranking women being used as kind of diplomatic tools or kind of trading chips. You know, they're kind of commodities to be passed from great kingdom to great kingdom. And if you think of the passage that I read about Clytemnestra weaving this kind of voluminous shroud that traps Agamemnon so he can then be butchered, he gets kind of hacked to death in the bath. You also have Helen is described in the Iliad as kind of embroidering a great purple robe. And of course, very famously, Penelope, the wife of Odysseus, while she's waiting for her husband to return, she's weaving and then unpicking her cloth through all the way to try and keep her suitors at bay. And this image of great women at the head of weavers, of servant girls, this again, there's absolutely evidence for this in the tablets that have survived from the Bronze Age palaces like Mycenae. And actually the kind of the image, so Linear B it's much more like Chinese or hieroglyphs. It's not an alphabet.
Yeah.
The image for a woman is you have two dots for a breast, you have kind of arms sticking out, you have what's clearly a skirt, and you have what seems to be a kind of curl of hair. So for a man, it's a straight line. You know, he's had his hair cut. For a woman, it's a kind of curve, like it's a braid or something. And all of this seems to kind of gel with what you get in Homer, the portrayal of great women and their ranks of servants.
Yeah.
Now, what, of course, about Helen herself? So this is the evidence that among lots of other evidence that Bettanid uses for the memories of Helen being rooted in Bronze Age ideals of beauty. So we talked about how Helen is described as Xanthé.
Yeah, golden haired
or red-haired perhaps. And Bettany points out that on the island of Thera, which was this great volcanic eruption,
modern day
set a
Santorini,
tsunami overwhelming Crete, which is one of the theories for where the story of Atlantis came from, and it buried these frescoes a bit like Pompeii, and that there are lots of portraits of aristocratic women on it, and most of them are, they have dark hair, but there are people with lighter hair. And she points out that there is one in particular who has red hair, who is, these are women close to the image of a deity, and that this woman is closest to the deity. And unlike most of the mortals don't wear a necklace, the necklace seems to be a symbol for a god, but this particular mortal, the one with the red hair, she is wearing a necklace. So perhaps there's a kind of implication there that to have red or golden hair is somehow seen as a marker of kind of semi-divine status.
Right.
It's a fascinating theory. There is we described how Helen is always described as being kind of white, like the shell of the egg from which she emerged. Lots of white lead oxide has been found, which seems to have been used as kind of cosmetics. So to quote Bettany, the overall effect is mesmerizing. Women made up in this way have great impact. They become walking effigies. Their faces take on the appearance of a mask. Their painted bodies move from the natural to the supernatural. So again, very, very potent. And I think that, I mean, obviously it's not conclusive, but it's interesting enough, I think, to satisfy the yearning that, I like. I've always wanted it. I kind of wanted it to be true.
So what all that is suggesting is that the portrait of Helen is a portrait of a powerful. It's not saying that somebody called Helen existed.
No,
but it's basically saying the portrait that you get of a golden-haired princess, very powerful. She lives in a world of servants and weavers. She moves through the palace. She is wearing white makeup to whiten her features.
Yeah, and she might be used as a kind of a chip in international relations.
Yeah, she might be sent away, or there might be some, who knows, some breakdown in negotiations in which possession of her becomes a political controversy. And also she wears a necklace that suggests that she might end up occupying a position that has a hint of the divine about it. And that's what Helen is ultimately representing. So when the story first begins to its first listeners, because of course it's an oral tradition, isn't it, with these stories initially, to the first listeners, she would be an immediately recognizable figure as a Bronze Age queen.
I mean, the thing is, we haven't really done an episode on the historicity of the Trojan War generally, but I mean, there is no question that there are fragments of language and of authentic elements of the Bronze Age world preserved in Homer. And I think the idea that the portrayal of queens, so like Helen, like Clytemnestra, in Homer, that preserves a memory that is true to the Bronze Age palaces, I think, is not beyond the bounds of possibility.
What about, as we move towards the end, what about this idea that that I guess a lot of feminist critics have advanced? They look. I mean, there's this huge trend, obviously now, isn't there, in fiction and literary fiction for rewriting the Greek myths and rewriting them. Often women writers who are rewriting them from a female's perspective, maybe giving the female characters more agency, or talking about the sexual violence that they suffer and all that kind of thing. Where do you think Helen and Clytemnestra stand? Because clearly for the Greeks who heard those stories, they were very unsettling figures. And you could, of course, argue from our perspective that, if you're a woman listening to that, presumably you're very conscious of the way in which they are objectified. Their sexuality is seen as something dangerous and deadly, and that is the beginning of a tradition that runs right through Western literature and is a kind of baleful tradition, if you like.
Well, I think that Clytemnestra certainly has agency. I mean, she butchers her husband in the bath. And Helen also has agency, and actually the kind of the post-classical tradition of casting her as a victim of rape denies her the agency that she has if she decides she's fed up with Menelaus, she's going to take her golden treasure and go off and hitch up with Paris. I think that Clytemnestra is clearly seen as a monstrous and terrifying figure, but she completely dominates Aeschylus's tragedy. I mean, she is by far the most powerful figure within it. And you could say that is an expression of the kind of the nightmares of Aeschylus's audience, because in Athens, women don't have any form of political power.
Yeah.
But they do have a role as mediators between the state of Athens and the gods. And Clytemnestra might serve as a kind of warning of what happens if women ignore that role. I mean, Greek tragedy is full of very, very powerful women, and it does seem that the power of those women is a kind of expression of anxieties that are kind of inherent within
these are women who've got above themselves. Is that basically what you're saying?
That I think it's above
punished
themselves.
For that? Or
it's not even that. It's just it's the notion that the proper order of things as the Athenians of the 5th century BC understand them, that it threatens catastrophe and disaster.
Yeah.
And that's why the fact that the cycle of revenge and bloodshed that Clytemnestra is involved in, the fact that it is settled by the virgin figure of Athena, who is, of course, herself female, but in the context of Athens is so important. Because Athena is indisputably powerful, but she's not embroiled in, she's not killing people and overthrowing them. Although, traditionally she always has done. But it's a very kind of specific vision of the role that women and men should properly play. And I think with Helen, she's incredibly powerful. She is terrifying, and it's the quality of all the heroes in Greek myth that they are powerful. And Isocrates, I think, is putting his finger on something very significant about those myths when he says that beauty is more powerful than strength.
So thank you for that, Tom. That was absolutely fascinating. Loads of things that we can come back to maybe in the rest of this history. So the Trojan War, the story of Schliemann, the Greek gods and Greek heroes more generally. But thank you very much for that tour de force. And on that bombshell, we will see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.